Most people asking this question already know the answer. They just don't like it. Not because the answer is obvious, but because the answer requires something from them, and that's the part nobody wants to talk about. So instead, they ask the question again. They search for it online. They watch videos about it. They bring it up in conversations with friends. And every single time, they're hoping someone will finally permit them to do one thing or the other, so they don't have to carry the weight of deciding for themselves. That's where this actually starts. Not with the job, with you. Because the real question isn't whether you should quit, the real question is why you can't figure out whether you should quit. And that confusion, that mental loop you've been stuck in, is telling you something much more important than any career advice ever could. So let's get into it honestly. You have a job that pays well. Maybe better than most people your age. Maybe better than what you grew up around. The money is real. The stability is real. But you wake up on Monday morning and something in your chest feels heavy. Not tired. Not lazy. Heavy. Like you're about to spend 8 hours doing something that has nothing to do with who you actually are. And the worst part isn't the job itself. The worst part is the guilt. Because you know people who would trade places with you instantly. You know people are working harder for less. You know people who can't even find work. And here you are, sitting in a good salary, decent benefits, maybe even a respectable title, feeling miserable about it. So you call yourself ungrateful. You tell yourself to toughen up. You compare your situation to something worse and convince yourself you should be happy. And for a few days, it works. You push through. You show up. You perform. And then Monday comes again. Here's what most people get wrong about this situation. They treat it like it's a simple choice between comfort and passion. Like the question is just, do you want security or do you want happiness? But that framing is too shallow. It skips the most important layer entirely. Because it's not really about the job. It's about what staying in that job is doing to you over time. Not this week, not this year, over the long arc of your working life. And that's the part most people refuse to calculate honestly. There's a version of this situation that looks fine on the outside for a long time. You keep the job, you keep the salary, you adjust your expectations, you find things outside of work to care about. Weekends, hobbies, relationships. And some people genuinely do find a version of peace in that arrangement. That's real, that exists. But there's another version that plays out much more often. And it looks like this. You stay not because you've made peace with it, but because you're afraid of what leaving looks like. You stay because you don't have a clear enough alternative. You stay because quitting feels like failure, even when the job itself is quietly draining you. And every year that passes, you become slightly more adapted to a life that doesn't quite fit. Your ambitions get quieter. Your risk tolerance shrinks. The window of possibility doesn't close all at once. It just gets a little smaller every year you wait. That's the damage that doesn't show up on any bank statement. Now, before we go any further, there's something you need to hear that most videos about this topic will skip entirely. Unhappiness at a job is not automatically a sign you're in the wrong place. Read that again. Some people are unhappy at their job because the work genuinely doesn't match who they are. That's real, and it matters. But a lot of people are unhappy at their job for reasons that have nothing to do with the job itself. They're unhappy because they're generally unfulfilled. They're unhappy because they have unresolved things going on in their personal life. They're unhappy because they've been avoiding building anything meaningful outside of work, and now work is getting the blame for a feeling that exists everywhere in their life. This is uncomfortable to say, but it needs to be said. Quitting a job does not fix a pattern. If the discontent lives inside you, it moves with you. New company, same feeling. New industry, same feeling. Higher salary somewhere else, same feeling 2 years in. So the very first thing you need to do, before you make any decision, is get brutally honest about what is actually the source of your unhappiness. Is it the specific job? Is it the specific company, the management, the culture, or the work itself? Or is it something deeper, a sense that your life isn't going in the direction you want, and work is just the most visible target? Because those two problems require completely different solutions. And mixing them up is how people make expensive mistakes. Let's say you've done that honest check. Let's say you look at your situation clearly and say, no, it's not me projecting. It's genuinely the work. The work itself doesn't connect to anything I care about. It doesn't use the parts of me I value. And I have been feeling this way for long enough that it's not just a rough season. Now the conversation gets more interesting. Here's what most people do at this stage. They sit with that clarity, feel slightly validated, and then immediately get stuck again. Because now the question shifts from, am I unhappy, to, what do I do about it? And that's where the overthinking really takes over. They start building imaginary timelines. I'll quit in 6 months. I'll quit when I have X amount saved. I'll quit when I figure out exactly what I want to do next. I'll quit after this project wraps up. I'll quit after the holidays. They make quitting a future event that depends on a series of conditions that keep changing, because subconsciously they know that as long as there are conditions, they never actually have to do it. The deadline is always real. The action never is. There's a particular kind of person who gets stuck in this loop longer than everyone else. They're smart enough to see the problem clearly. They're thoughtful enough to understand the risks. And they're self-aware enough to know that impulsive decisions can backfire. All of those things are genuinely good qualities. But those same qualities, when applied to a decision they're afraid of, become the perfect excuse for permanent delay. Intelligence becomes analysis paralysis. Thoughtfulness becomes overthinking. Self-awareness becomes second-guessing. And they spend months, sometimes years, turning the question over in their mind with complete intellectual seriousness and absolutely zero forward movement. If that sounds familiar, it's not because you're broken. It's because this is one of the most human patterns there is. We are wired to avoid loss more than we chase gain. A salary you already have feels more real than a life you haven't built yet. So your brain keeps finding reasons to wait, because waiting feels like a strategy when it's actually just fear in a suit. Now let's talk about money, because we have to. The most common reason people stay in jobs they hate is financial. And the most common mistake people make about that reason is treating it as a permanent wall instead of a temporary constraint. If you're unhappy at a job and financially unable to quit right now, that's not a tragedy. That's just a situation. The question is what you do with that situation. Do you use the time you have left in that job to genuinely build toward something else? Or do you use the salary as a comfortable enough cushion that you never feel quite enough pressure to move? This is where a lot of people quietly self-deceive. They say they're staying for financial stability. But what they're actually doing is using financial stability as a permission slip to not face the harder question of what they actually want. The money is real. The constraint is real. But the money is also, for some people, the most convenient reason to never have to risk anything. So if money is genuinely the reason you're staying right now, fine. That's legitimate. But then the question becomes, what are you doing with that time? Are you building savings deliberately? Are you developing a skill, a freelance business, a side income, or a clearer plan? Or are you just waiting for the discomfort to become unbearable enough to force your hand? Because there's a big difference between staying strategically and staying passively. One of them moves you forward even while you're stuck. The other one just keeps you stuck longer. Here's a scenario that plays out quietly in a lot of people's lives. A person graduates, gets a decent job, earns real money for the first time, and spends a few years adapting their life to that income level. The apartment gets better. The car gets newer. The lifestyle subtly expands. And then the day they start feeling unhappy about the job, they realize, consciously or not, that their entire life is now calibrated around this salary. Quitting doesn't just mean leaving the job. It means renegotiating the lifestyle. It means the apartment might have to change. The car might have to change. Certain habits and routines might have to change. And so the unhappiness stays, but the job stays too. Because the cost of leaving has quietly become higher than just the emotional cost of starting over. Now there's an entire life structure that depends on that paycheck. This is called lifestyle inflation. And it is one of the most effective traps there is, because it happens gradually, it feels like success while it's happening, and it only reveals itself as a trap when you try to make a different choice. If you're in this position, you need to look at your expenses with the same honesty you're applying to your career. Not to punish yourself, but to understand what real options actually exist. Because sometimes the path out of a job you hate runs directly through simplifying your life first. That's not failure. That's leverage. Let's talk about the people who quit. Not the ones who made it look clean on social media. The real ones. Some of them quit and found exactly what they were looking for. New work, new energy, new sense of direction. The leap was worth it. They'll tell you that. But a lot of them quit and found something different on the other side. Not a disaster. Just reality. The freedom felt good for about 3 weeks, and then the anxiety about income started to build. The new job or new direction turned out to have its own frustrations. The grass was genuinely different, but not always greener. And here's what the smart ones understood from that experience. They didn't regret leaving, but they realized the leaving itself was only half the work. The other half was knowing what they were building toward. And the people who struggled most after quitting were usually the ones who had a very clear picture of what they were escaping, but almost no picture of what they were actually moving toward. Escape is not a direction. It's a reaction. If your plan is mainly defined by what you're leaving behind, you haven't actually made a plan yet. You've exited. And exits without destinations tend to land people somewhere, temporarily and slightly disorienting. So before you quit anything, you need a toward. Not a perfect plan. Not a fully funded business model. Not a 5-year roadmap with guaranteed outcomes. But a genuine answer to the question, what am I actually trying to build? Because that answer, even in rough form, changes the quality of every decision that follows. There's one thing that doesn't get said enough in conversations like this. And it needs to be said plainly. Staying in a job you hate for a long time, not strategically, not temporarily, but indefinitely, does something to a person. It's not dramatic. It doesn't happen all at once. But over the years, it tends to narrow people. They become more risk-averse because they've adapted to a life built around security. They become less curious because curiosity was never required. They become quieter about their real desires because talking about them starts to feel pointless. None of that shows up on a resume. None of it shows up in a salary comparison. But it shapes how a person moves through the world. And the people who wake up at 50 feeling deeply disconnected from themselves are very often the people who made a series of quiet, sensible-seeming decisions in their 20s and 30s that slowly moved them further and further from who they actually wanted to be. This is not meant to be a horror story. It's meant to be a calibration. The cost of staying somewhere wrong for too long is real. It's just not billed to you immediately, so it's easy to underestimate. So, where does all of this leave you? If you've made it this far, you're probably not someone who's going to make a reckless decision. You think too carefully for that. The real risk for someone like you isn't that you'll jump too fast. It's that you'll wait too long, and call it patience when it's actually fear. The question isn't really whether you should quit. The real questions are, what specifically is making you unhappy, and is that something that changes if you stay? What are you actually moving toward, not just away from? What is the financial reality, and what are you doing right now to create more options? And are you waiting strategically, genuinely building towards something, or are you just waiting because waiting is easier than deciding? Those are the questions that matter. And only you can answer them honestly. Here's the clean truth to walk away with. A good salary is worth something. Stability is worth something. But neither of them is worth more than the compounding cost of spending the best and most energetic years of your life building someone else's dream in a direction that means nothing to you. The goal is not to be reckless. The goal is to be honest early enough that you still have real choices. Because the people who feel most trapped aren't usually the ones who took a risk that didn't work out. They're the ones who never took the risk at all, and lived the rest of their life wondering what would have happened if they did. That's the thing about a decision like this. You don't get to make it forever. You only get to make it while the window is still open.